So you can see where you begin, what begins as a solution, or at least appeared to be a solution, evolves or devolves into a massive problem. And yet, attempts to solve it that are not systemic in and of themselves simply leave us with another set of problems. Now, I'm looking at your faces, and I was giving a talk on oil in LA a couple years ago, and this woman raised her hand. She said, you know, my husband was going to try to be here tonight, but he didn't finish the book. He wanted to finish the book. He's at home. He's about halfway through. He's prone to depression. Should I call him up and tell him to stop reading? and you know, so I mean, you know, I do tend to really push the sort of the bad news side of the equation here. And why? I mean, if you've just sort of created a new narrative and you're wanting to introduce it to a mainstream audience, and you've just succeeded in depressing them to the point of suicide, what have you accomplished? I think, though, that unless you get down to brass tacks and help people understand that the system itself is sick, they're going to continue to come back at you with this kind of sense of wonder. It's like, why do you keep wanting to undo the whole system when you could just fix the top? Until they understand the system itself is sick, they're not going to recognize the need for a deeper solution. You know, and they're going to continue to ask for these sort of surface solutions. Once you've addressed complexity, they will recognize that the solutions have to be complex, or if not complex in themselves, they've got to acknowledge the complexity of the system and of the problems. That's the one thing. The other thing they'll recognize is that there's not going to be any quick solutions, which is important because this is a society that expects things to be done quickly. It expects, you know, to be able to have a solution in the form of a product that I can go buy, and it says on it organic, or it says on it free range, and that's all I have to think about. This is a society that has arisen around this notion of alternative food. The truth is, and we all know this, that those labels don't address the entire complex nature of the system. So until we explain that story fully, we don't have a mainstream consumer who's ready to accept that. So once we've addressed this level of complexity, once we've come up with a new story, consumers begin to realize that, again, the solution has to be complex, it won't be quick, but probably most important, they're not going to get their status quo back. They're not going to be able to go back to a system that externalized costs, that didn't address complexity. This is going to be the toughest thing to sell, that they may not get a system back that gave them food that was getting cheaper every year, or that allowed them to have pretty much anything they wanted to eat from any part of the world, any time of year. I mean, how do you go back and talk about the notion of seasonality? You know, how do you explain that strawberries probably only should be available a few weeks a year, or maybe not should, I've got to be careful here, but perhaps there's an argument to be made that strawberries should be available only a few times a year. How do you begin to address that? It's tough. It's really tough. And yet this is an argument that has at least got to be raised. Now, I suppose the final result of a more complex narrative is that people begin to see what the solutions are going to have to look like. And you don't have a specific solution, but you begin to have a criteria. Again, you notice that the solution is going to have to be complex. You notice it's not going to be quick. But then you begin to realize who the players are going to have to be and what they're going to have to do. If we look at the federal government, what is the proper role of the federal government here? Well, right now the federal government, you know, for 50 years has simply attempted to move commodities. What's the new role? Right now we have President Obama who's attempting to redefine what's the food role of the government. And yet we're already starting to see the signs that it's going to have a pretty heavy commodity nature to it. You know, political realities are political realities, but at the same time we also need to recognize the federal government has a specific and proper role here. And that is refilling the research pipeline. I mean, politically, we're not there yet to begin remaking the food system. We're on the verge, we're moving, we're building awareness. We're not there yet. Let's say we get there in 5 years. Let's say in 5 years there's enough critical mass, enough concern, where we're ready to do something serious and fundamental and change the system. The problem is we don't have and won't have then the tools we need to fix the system because we've let the research pipeline go completely dry. If you go look at the amount of money this country spends on researching new food technologies, new food methods that are even close to being classified as alternative, it is tiny. We've essentially turned over the research arm to the private sector. We've said, you guys do it. You're much better at doing it. And the truth is that the private sector will only attack research problems that show short-term profit potential. I mean, why else, you know, why wouldn't they? It's entirely natural. It is government's rightful job to be tackling those research jobs that aren't profitable now but could be profitable in 10 or 15 years. So that is absolutely essential. So that's the first job. I think the second job is we need to rethink subsidies. Subsidies have gotten a terrible name, and rightly so, because we've been subsidizing the wrong kinds of commodities. But the truth is that if we're going to rebuild this system, we have to recognize that the alternative models that may eventually replace the system we've got today, those models don't have any traction in the marketplace right now. They're not working because the market doesn't even recognize them. Those models are going to need support. That's what we need to be supporting. You know, right now, we need to think about the new scales of farming. Clearly, we don't need to subsidize gigantic farms, agribusiness. Those farms are actually doing quite well by themselves. What we do need to support is the mid-scale farm. You know, right now, the mid-scale farm is the one that's most rapidly disappearing, and yet the mid-scale farm is the most critical, or one of the most critical building blocks in putting together this next food system. Why? Because it's got the scale, the size to get economies of scale to keep prices reasonable, but it's also small enough that that farmer knows every acre and knows how that acre should and shouldn't be farmed. And yet that is the scale of farm that is disappearing most rapidly. What we're ending up with is a hollowing of the middle. We've got farms that are huge and we've got farms that are tiny. And while those are part of the solution, they cannot do this by themselves. And yet we need to support that middle. How do we do that? How do we go about doing that? Well, for years the idea is you support a crop by giving a farmer a per bushel, essentially a per bushel refund. We need to rethink how we target our subsidies. It turns out one of the things that drives farmers out of farming is what? Why do farmers end up taking off-farm jobs? Because they can't get health care in many cases. They can't get health care. They end up taking jobs because that's the only way they can afford insurance. Once they've begun taking an off-farm job, the progression has begun. The chances that they will leave farming altogether go up. And the chances they'll be able to convince their children to go into farming are almost nil. So how do you reverse that? It may be that the thing we need to subsidize is health care for farmers. This isn't the kind of solution you think about when you're trying to build an alternative food system. It's not romantic. It has nothing to do with hoeing and tilling. But it may be one of the most critical things we can do. Those are the kinds of subsidies we need to start thinking of. You know, and we mustn't think necessarily that an alternative food system is going to be so self-sustaining that we don't have to spend any money on it. It's going to be hugely expensive, particularly as we start it. You know, in the same way that consumers are going to need to probably spend more money for food that's truly sustainable, this country's going to need to spend considerably more money to make a food system that's sustainable, particularly at the beginning. We're going to be trying a lot of different things. Many of them will fail. We're in an experimental stage right now. And by contrast, the commodity industrial system has gotten to the point where it doesn't want to experiment. It wants systems where they've pushed the risk out. But once you've pushed the risk out, you've pushed out a chance for innovation. And we're going to have to move back into a sort of an innovation zone. But innovation is inherently risky. So we're moving back into a time of risk. The last thing that I think where government can play a role, but this is where it merges both with community, local, and individual roles, is in coming up with a new way of talking about food. So I think the challenges here are really to recognize the problems we've got, recognize the complexity, but come up with new narratives, new ways to discuss these. Narratives that expand the discussion, bring in a new audience. And it's an experimental phase. I mean, you're going to have to find, you're going to have to try approaches. Some of them will work, some of them won't. But what's critical is that we start. What's critical is that we recognize that the market, again, is not going to do this for us. I mean, the market's going to assist us. We're not going to be able to do this without the market. But the market by itself will not. We're going to need to make this revolution happen, again, the old-fashioned way. And part of that is going to be with a new story.